I'm a gig worker who did typing and computer work for the elderly. It didn't start out that way, but most of the jobs I picked up back then involved helping older people navigate technology. It wasn't too bad and actually paid pretty well for what it was. I was contacted by a man named Robert who had recently lost his vision and needed some data entry work done. He lived about 70 miles outside of the city, and normally I wouldn't take a job that far, but I was strapped for cash and needed to pay rent. We agreed on an 8-hour block of time to start with, and I was scheduled to be at his house on a Monday morning. I used Waze to get familiar with the route, and getting there seemed pretty straightforward. I took the highway for the first stretch of the drive, and then took his exit. It was fall, and the leaves were changing, which made the drive really beautiful, actually. I made a few turns until the roads were no longer paved, and then I drove some more until I found the right number at the end of a long, winding driveway. He lived out in the woods. It was a beautiful house that blended right into the landscape. It was nice, but you could tell that it was past its prime. It needed some landscaping and some repairs, but nothing major. Robert was a nice man, deliberate and kind, and was still learning to navigate his own house with his new blindness. He wore sunglasses, and when I asked him how he had lost his sight, he said, "Oh, you wouldn't believe me if I told you." I didn't ask him any more about his condition. I wondered how he was able to live all alone in this big house in the middle of the woods. His housekeeper, Abby, was there a few hours a day, but otherwise he was by himself. He showed me to his home office, which was full of books and paperwork, with an entire wall made of glass that overlooked the woods. I remember thinking how devastating losing his sight must have been for an avid reader, and how losing this beautiful view of the forest would kill me. We got to work. He dictated to me, and I typed for hours. We took breaks, and Abby made us some tea. It was actually a great day, out there surrounded by trees, away from everyone and everything. It was relaxing. I lost track of time until I saw Abby getting her jacket on. She seemed like she was in a rush and said a quick goodbye to Robert. She gave me a nervous half smile, and out she went. She walked quickly to her car and drove down the driveway. It was getting dark, and I checked the clock. 4:33 p.m. I had about an hour left with Robert, and I let him know. We wrapped up a few more transcriptions, and I gathered my things. He told me that he'd like me to come back next week for more hours, and he hoped I could make time in my schedule for a weekly appointment with him. We agreed to it, and I shook his outstretched hand. I packed my laptop and realized the house was pretty dark both inside and out. I suppose when you can't see, it doesn't matter, but just the same, I wish there was more light, especially for me getting to my car and then down the road. He showed me to the door and told me to drive safely and keep my doors locked. I didn't think much of his warning, but keeping your doors locked seemed a little overkill way out here from the city. As I left, I heard him double lock the door behind me. I started the drive back home. I turned left out of his long driveway and was just getting into my podcast when I realized it was taking too long to get to the first intersection before the highway. The road was more winding than I'd remembered, and when I didn't reach the paved part of the road, I knew I had gone in the wrong direction. I tried pulling up Waze again, but there was no signal. I would need to backtrack on my own. It was true dark now, and there weren't many landmarks as I drove. The fallen leaves on the road didn't help. I saw them dust up behind me as I drove. I knew I must have taken a wrong turn early on, but then I'd taken a couple of turns after that, obviously also wrong, and now I was fully lost. I was feeling uncomfortable and confused. I hated being lost. I stopped the car and put it in park. I just needed to take a few deep breaths and get my mind centered again. I turned the podcast down and actually opened the window. Maybe if I cleared my head. I put it back in drive and kept going. There was a bend ahead, and I craned my neck to see what was beyond it. Just around the bend, about 30 feet ahead of me, was a person standing in the road. He was wearing a black hooded sweatshirt, and I couldn't see his face because of the angle of his head. He didn't have a car that I could see, and he wasn't moving. I was stunned, just idling there in the night, facing this person who was just not moving. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I had to get out of there. I started backing up, and that's when he raised his head. He had a horrifying face. Was it a mask? It looked like his skin was loose, and it didn't fit his face. His eyes were bulging, and there were no eyelids. Then he smiled with hideous teeth and started running full tilt towards my car. I floored it. I lurched forward with the impact of my car hitting the tree behind me. I had no hope of getting away on these tight wooded roads. My head hit the headrest hard, and I felt a little woozy, but I had to get it together. My car was wedged across the road, and I could see him reaching for the unlocked passenger door. I popped open my door and started running. I ran into the woods, my face and arms feeling the sting of branches as I lurched forward. I heard a laugh behind me. It sounded inhuman. As I ran, I heard that thing gaining on me. My new eyes don't work as well as I'd like. I'll take yours instead. My town and the surrounding area has been in economic decline for years. As businesses closed and moved away, abandoned buildings loomed all along the highways leading into town. The vast properties clung like shadows to the outskirts of town, a constant reminder of death and decomposition. It was hard for people around here, and most people moved away for better opportunities elsewhere. I wanted to do the same, but my mom still lived in town and refused to leave. She can't walk very well anymore, and asking her to uproot for me, or moving and making her live alone, was just too much to ask. I'd stay until I had to go. My plan was to wait and save. There was a new industry cropping up, though, and I literally mean growing. With laws changing, certain plant growers needed indoor spaces to grow year-round, and these old facilities were perfect. I went out on a limb and bought a drone. I planned to use it to get into aerial photography for real estate businesses interested in marketing to these growers. I grew up with a controller in my hand, so drone flying was easy for me to pick up. Basically, real-life gaming. I contracted with a woman named Josephine, a business realtor in the city who needed drone work done before Monday. It was 7:20 p.m. on Thursday. She gave me a list of 3 addresses. The faster I could submit the footage, the better. I got an early start on Friday morning. It was summer, which meant longer daylight hours, and the footage would really pop with all the greenery. The downside was that the locations were badly overgrown. I had to stay close to the drone because if I crashed it, Finding it in the underbrush would be a huge pain. I completed 2 buildings before noon, and if I hustled to the last one, I could edit overnight and everything would be waiting in Josephine's inbox by Saturday morning. I reached the last property, the Fog Mining Complex, at 4:28 p.m. The layout was huge. There was a main administrative building that had 4 stories, flanked by 2 smaller flat buildings. The second of these 2 was located close to the mine entrance and had a large landing area, presumably where equipment was staged before being used in the mine. It was the farthest building from me, so I decided to end with that one. I loaded new batteries and threw the drone up to record. I had only been filming for about 3 minutes when the low battery warning came on. Well, that was odd. The batteries were supposed to be fresh. Drone batteries do die fast, so I had plenty of extras and a recharge station in my car. The battery had drained so fast, I didn't even have time to bring the drone back to me before it died. Now I had to go look for it. The last footage I saw was of the back of the administrative building, so I trekked across the entrance of the building, wildly overgrown and littered with old trash. I had been so focused on getting my deadline met that I hadn't considered what I could be walking into. The last 2 properties I had already completed were closer to town and probably better patrolled by police. There had been far less trash, and there were clear "keep out" signs and barricades. This building had no signs and no barricades. It was freely accessible to anyone who drove down the old mining road I had taken to get here. I listened for any sign of movement near the buildings and scanned around me as I approached the side of the building. It was quiet except for birds and the sound of my own steps along the overgrown pavement. The underbrush was starting to creep along the building's walls, and I had to keep close to avoid getting tangled. I turned the corner to the back of the building and saw my drone caught in some branches. I was relieved to see I didn't have to go climbing for it, and that it was still in one piece. I picked it up and was about to install new batteries when the full charge indicator lit up. I stood looking at it, confused as to why it was now reading full charge when it had just died and fallen into the trees. I ran through my head the possibilities of why it would have stopped working, and I figured I must have hit a button on the controller. I was backtracking around the corner of the building towards where I had been when I got a thunderstorm alert warning on my phone. I knew I was running out of time. I launched the drone again, this time finishing my loop around the building without issue. I landed the drone gently and checked the battery. It had plenty of battery life left. I could hear a low rumble of thunder in the distance and started working faster. I changed some settings and sent the drone up again. I only had the 2 shorter buildings left. To get to the first of the 2 smaller buildings, I had to walk around the administrative building. There was a path, as though something or someone had been walking there regularly. The thought that there could be somebody living on the property was really getting into my head at this point. It was quiet, but I started feeling like I was being watched. I looked up at the wall of the tall building, pockmarked by broken windows. The fact that someone could be looking down on me from one of those windows watching me as I moved around this empty building alone gave me the creeps. As I reached the back of the building, the path that had been worn down in the brush led towards the building closest to the mine. I figured that if I could stay away from that last building, I might be able to avoid any confrontation with a homeless person or someone hanging around that old abandoned building. I sent the drone up again and suddenly became aware that the whirring sound of the drone was all I could hear. The sounds of birds and trees had stopped entirely. Everything had gone silent. I watched as my drone cleared the roof and the second building, and I had to concentrate to be sure it didn't hit anything on that roof. I was just finishing the loop around the back of building number 2 when I heard a giant crack of thunder. I was almost out of time. I couldn't let the drone get wet, but I also didn't want to have to come back here tomorrow. As I flew the drone back to me, I saw movement inside the darkness of the third building. It was fast, like animal fast. By the time I looked from the drone to the building, nothing was moving. Everything was still. I checked the battery, and it was about to die, so I switched to a fresh one and sent it up one last time. For a little flair, I had planned to send the drone around the back of the building and end with a shot pulling away from the landing area. Even with the storm coming, being pressed for time, and being a little freaked out by this old property, I wanted to get the shot just right. I sent the drone around the back of the building, and as I brought it towards the front, I could have sworn that I saw something moving in the doorway of the building where the platform was. But I had already veered away from the door, and the drone was heading back towards me. Just like before, the battery suddenly went dead. The breeze was picking up and the air smelled like rain. I had to get out of there. Somewhere between me and that last building, the creepy one where I thought I'd seen movement, I had to go rescue my drone. I was feeling pretty scared, but I didn't really have time to think. I had to go get that drone and save the footage before it started raining. I tracked through the underbrush and the loose bricks scattered around from the crumbling old buildings, and finally reached the spot where I thought my drone had landed. I looked everywhere in the underbrush, but couldn't find it. I had to go closer. As I reached the rise leading to the platform of that last building, I could feel the first drops of rain starting. I rushed ahead and then stopped in my tracks. Just ahead of me, in the center of the courtyard, was my drone, standing neatly on its little feet, as though someone had placed it in the dead center of the platform. I scanned around quickly, but saw nothing. There was no movement, just the quick pops of raindrops landing on the dusty platform. I ran forward and picked up my drone. And again, it not only had power, but also a full charge. I was about to turn and jog down to my car when I saw movement at the door leading from the platform into the dark building, just 60 feet or so away from me. Standing just inside the dark building was something hideous. Something or someone terrifying was standing there, smiling at me. To say it was human would be generous. It looked like a corpse come to life, leaning forward, its neck jutting towards me, craned at a weird angle. It grinned wildly at me. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I don't know how long we looked at each other, but it felt like minutes passed. I remember feeling stuck. I took a step backwards, and its smile grew. I had to run, but I couldn't make my feet move. I could feel the rain hitting my face, and the thought that my drone shouldn't get wet crossed my mind, but these were rational thoughts, and what I was looking at was not rational. I turned and ran down the path, the same path that now made sense for being worn down. I felt my feet slamming against the ground, the shock of each footstep sending pain up my legs as I willed them to go faster. Behind me, I heard it coming after me. It was fast, but I had a head start. I could see my car ahead. It was raining hard now, and the underbrush was slick. I remember thinking that falling would be the last thing I would ever do. I grabbed the car door handle and threw it open, thankful that this small town taught me I didn't need to lock my doors. I threw the drone into the passenger seat and got in. I looked up towards the path and saw nothing but rain and that horrifying old administrative building. I squealed my tires getting out of there and drove straight home. I don't think I caught my breath or even slowed down for the entire 20-minute drive. I tried coming up with reasons for what I had seen. Was it somebody playing a prank? Why would somebody's face look so distorted, and why would they be there watching and then chasing me? I debated what to do next. I knew how crazy my story would sound to the police or anybody else. I started convincing myself that it was somebody who wanted to scare people away from the building. Something totally rational, something that wasn't paranormal. My mom was still awake when I got home, watching one of her true crime shows on TV in the dark. She looked up as I came in. "I knew it was you. I saw you on the camera." My mom was a little paranoid and liked knowing who was coming into the house. She had had me install a camera inside the door, even though the only person she saw coming and going was me. It was a cheap little camera, and she could check the feed from her phone. It was a safe town, but it made her feel safer, so I didn't care. She turned back to her show, and I didn't stop to talk. I wanted to see the drone footage, but was also terrified to watch. "You locked the door, right?" "Yep," I lied. I closed the door to my room, locking that door behind me, just in case. I didn't want to be disturbed. I kicked off my wet boots and socks and changed my clothes. I turned on my computer and connected the drone. My lips were dry as I forwarded through to the end. When I was filming the second building, there was movement in the third building. Something rushed past a window. It was a gray flash moving towards the door, but then it never reappeared. I forward to the end. As the drone rounded the corner of the last building, it picked up movement at the door. But then it started spinning and the video cut out. I went back and tried slowing it down. But there was just that gray flash of movement, nothing discernible. The next clip is of my feet walking towards it, and of my face checking the camera. The last seconds before I saw it. The creature I saw there was never clearly visible in any of my footage. As I sat trying to think, I was aware of a sound coming from the door. It sounded like my mom was walking in the hallway, and I was glad I had locked the door. I needed to consider my next move, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to share what had happened with anyone just yet. I heard the TV in the living room. It was loud. A woman was screaming. Those true crime shows were so dramatic. I put on my headphones so I could concentrate. I wanted proof of what I'd seen, but I had none. If I told people what had occurred, they'd think I was lying. Honestly, a part of me thought that if I had found some creepy footage, I could at least post it on YouTube and go viral. Something good could come out of all the hell I'd been through today. I just needed the footage, and I didn't have any. After all that adrenaline finally left my body, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up and the TV was still on. That was strange. It was past 1, long past my mom's usual bedtime. I opened my door and walked towards the living room. It was dark, but the floor was still wet from my boots. The TV was playing some old sitcom now. I peeked into the room, and the chair where my mom had been sitting was now black. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I turned on the lamp by the chair. The chair was covered in blood. It was drenched. Blood pooled on the seat, all over the floor, and splashed up against the walls. I stumbled backwards and fell, slipping on the wet floor. Looking down the hallway, I saw more blood and drag marks leading to the front door, then disappearing under it. I saw my own footsteps. I had been walking in that blood. I screamed. I called for my mom, but there was no answer. I flipped over onto my hands and knees and slid on the wet floor. Everything I touched was drenched in blood. I was covered in blood. My hands were red now. I ran to my mom's bedroom, but it was empty. The house was silent except for the TV and the pounding in my brain. I ran sliding to the front door and flung it open. The drag marks continued into the grass and towards the woods. It was so dark I couldn't see much beyond that. My car was parked where I'd left it, but the driver's side back door was wide open. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. I could feel the panic rising, and my skin was clammy. My mom's camera! I ran back to the living room. The smell of blood was suffocating. I picked up her phone and searched for the app. There were 3 movement notifications. The first was me entering the house. The second clip showed the front door opening and that thing from the mine slipping through the door and into my house. It skitters down the hallway unnaturally. I am full on panicking now. I cannot breathe. It must have been in the car with me. I hit play on the last notification. It was this thing, this creature, dragging my mother's eviscerated body down the hallway of my house towards the front door. Before it leaves, it turns and stands at my bedroom door. Then it slowly turns to the camera and smiles. That horrific face is there in my house, staring at me through that camera. Then the camera cuts out and there's only static. That thing had gotten into my unlocked house, walked past my bedroom, and had killed my mom with me in the next room. I had brought it home. It was my fault she was dead. With shaking hands and my whole body shivering uncontrollably, I dialed the police. 911, what's your emergency? Something killed my mom. I have the footage. I told them what happened and hung up the phone. I sobbed as I waited for the police. Through my tears, I heard the drone in my bedroom turn on. I live in Oklahoma, where we're no strangers to massive thunderstorms that can shake the very foundation of a house. Tornadoes are a regular occurrence around here too. And let me tell you, when those warnings sound off at night, it's a whole different level of intensity. The darkness wraps around you, and you're left with nothing but your instincts to survive. It was July, and the weather forecast predicted another round of chaos for tonight. I made sure to check the batteries in my flashlight, knowing full well that I might need them. Hours later, I was abruptly awakened by a wall-shaking crack of thunder and a blinding flash of lightning that pierced through my room. The storm had arrived with a vengeance. I reached for my phone to check the time, but it wasn't where I had left it. I always had my phone with me. I was still foggy with sleep, listening to the relentless downpour outside, when I reached for the flashlight just in case the power went out. It wasn't where I'd left it either. I sat up and swung my legs off the bed. That's when I felt it. A sudden movement at the foot of my bed, as if something had jumped off of it. I don't have a dog or a cat. My mind struggled to make sense of it. I focused my eyes where I had felt the movement, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had stirred. I held my breath, desperate to hear any sign of movement. Then the house plunged into an eerie stillness as the hum of the AC stopped. The power had gone out, leaving me in pitch-black darkness with the raging storm outside. I pressed myself against the wall, sliding my hands against it to orient myself. I inched blindly along the wall, my outstretched hand fumbling through the darkness. I reached the bedroom door, and that's when I heard it. An earth-shattering roar like a freight train echoed in my bedroom, and I knew there was a tornado nearby. My blood ran cold. In a surge of adrenaline, I turned and lunged towards my closet, the only space in my small house with no exterior walls or windows. My heart raced as I tried to become fully awake and reach the closet before disaster struck. I felt the edge of the door, twisted the doorknob, and slid inside the cramped space. I was drenched in sweat now, panting and bracing for impact, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me as I clung to the little space I had left, careful to avoid the stacked boxes that crowded the back. The relentless storm outside raged on. But then I heard another sound. It was the distinct sound of heavy breathing behind me. My muscles tensed, and I turned to face what was in the closet with me. I huddled closer to the closet's wall, straining to see through the darkness. With my trembling hand, I groped for the closet door, ready to swing it open and make a run for it. But then my other hand brushed against something solid. My old baseball bat. With a tight grip on the bat, I turned and swung as hard as I could into the darkness. I heard the crash and felt 1,000 tiny cuts all over my arms, face, and shoulders. I stumbled backwards and fell. That's when I remembered the mirror at the back of my closet. I laughed nervously, relieved it was only my mind playing tricks on me. I slumped down to the ground and caught my breath. The storm was subsiding, and I had to go clean myself up. I took a deep breath to calm down and leaned forward to stand up. I felt the tiny droplets of blood tracing their path down my arm. Before I could get up, I felt something slowly lick the trickle of blood on my arm. I don't have a dog or a cat. I don't like it when the bus is late in the mornings. It's not because I'm the only pickup at my stop or that it's still dark out. Those are normal things out here in the sticks. What I don't like is that for the past few weeks, something has been watching me from the edge of the woods whenever my bus is running late. It stays crouched down, but I can feel it watching me, and it's been getting closer. I know because the smell of death is getting closer. From what I've been able to see with quick glimpses, it's pale and has long legs and arms. I can't even tell if it's wearing clothes because it seems to blend with the trees so well. It is human-shaped, though, but the proportions are all wrong. At least that's what I think. When I smell it, I watch the edge of the woods. The branches will move and I hear the leaves rustle. It moves low to the ground, so I know it's trying to stay hidden. I'd like to say I'm not scared or that it's my imagination, but it's not. And I know if I tell anyone, I'm gonna sound crazy. So I don't. I just hope that my bus is on time. I've also been waiting until the last minute before I might be late to leave my house in the mornings. I dread that dark morning walk down our long dirt road to the bus stop. Our house is surrounded by woods, and until this thing started watching me, I loved the woods. But now, that thing could be anywhere. My stepbrother Chris came home from college for Thanksgiving and teased me for locking the door when I got home from school. Out here, it's normal to leave your doors unlocked, and until I started seeing that thing by the bus stop, I never locked them either. But now I'm the only one that locks the doors. I hesitated for a moment, but Chris and I were always close. I told him about the thing at the bus stop, and his face went white. "It's still there?" His voice shook. "I started seeing it when I was your age, out in the trees. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. No chance. The first time I heard it out there, I threw rocks towards the trees. It smelled so bad, I thought it was a bear. I got this sharp pain in my head, and then the next thing I saw was the bus driver trying to wake me up. He said his headlights caught something moving into the trees, and then he saw me on the ground, but whatever it was had disappeared. After that, I tried ignoring it because it freaked me out so much. Week after week, it kept getting closer. I remember turning my back to it, staring away from the trees and hearing it moving behind me. It was like a skittering sound, and it would move forward and stop, move forward and stop. This went on for weeks, and the smell, it was unbearable. When it finally got so close, I could almost taste its stench. It vanished. And then I stopped seeing it. I thought I was going crazy. It's the most terrifying thing I've ever been through. Chris drove back to school on the Sunday before school started for me, and I felt relieved that I had told him. Now at least I had a plan. All I had to do was not turn around, not look at it, and then this thing in the woods should go away on its own. That next day, I left my house just on time to make it to the bus stop. I didn't want to wait any longer than I had to, but as I walked fast down my dirt driveway in the dark, I felt a tiny bit braver, even hopeful. As I reached the bus stop, I checked my watch. The bus was late again. I turned my back to the woods. It was already there. I knew because I didn't hear it coming through the trees, only heard a light rustle as I approached. Also, I knew it from the smell, the putrid smell of rot and death. As I stood perfectly still, I heard twigs crack as it moved, and the smell got stronger. It was moving towards me and getting closer. I could hear my heart in my ears, and every cell in my body wanted to run. I just wanted to get away before it reached me. But I stood my ground, remembering what Chris said. This was how I could make it go away for good. And just like Chris said, it moved forward and stopped, moved forward and stopped. I could hear it now just behind me. It was a sound like panting, but more wet, like a gurgle. It was so close. I shut my eyes hard and waited for it to turn and go back into the woods. I felt the pain in my head and fell to the ground. That pain in my head was unbearable, and I heard my scalp tearing as I struggled to open my eyes. My shoulder was on fire. There was something in my shoulder, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The stench was so thick I wanted to vomit. I was moving, but not on my own. Something was dragging me by my hair and shoulder through the woods. I turned my eyes to see a long barb sticking through my shoulder, tearing through my skin. It was green and jagged like an arrow. I could feel the points tearing inside my shoulder as it pulled. I followed it up to see that it was the creature's tail. Long, pale legs were moving fast, dragging me forward, farther into the woods than I had ever been. In these last horrific moments, I wondered if things would have been different if the bus had just been on time. My family has a cabin deep in the Alaska wilderness. This is the kind of cabin you need a four-wheel drive truck to get to. When I was in my early 20s, I decided to go up to the cabin in late summer. My parents were busy with my younger sister going to college, and the roads would be impassable if an early snow fell. I made it to the cabin early in the afternoon and opened it up. After unloading some of my stuff, I packed a light backpack to go to the lake about a half-mile away. I had almost reached the lake when I heard something large cross the path behind me. I turned to look, but whatever it was disappeared into the brush at the edge of the trail. I was about 15 feet away from whatever it was, and I stood silently listening for a minute to see if I could identify what it was. I had hoped it was a deer and not a bear or a moose. When I didn't hear anything, I reached into my bag for my bear mace and had it ready for the rest of the hike to the lake. I wanted to put some distance between myself and that area in case it was a bear, so I picked up the pace. Being from Alaska, bear safety is always in the back of my mind, but I still respect and fear them. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When you're alone, your mind imagines the worst-case scenario, and I imagined a grizzly with cubs popping out of the woods at any moment. But nothing like that happened. When I got to the lake, I stripped down to my bathing suit and sandals and jumped into the cool water. I was lying on my back, the water muffling my ears, when I saw movement on the lake edge by my backpack. I saw something crouched down over my backpack with its back to me. At first, I thought it was a light-colored bear. But as I splashed upright in the water, it turned to look at me. It was a skinny woman, wearing what must have at one point been a short white dress, but it was smudged with dirt now and torn at the hem. She was barefoot, and her hair was a tangled mess. Her face was thin and dirty, and she snarled at me before letting out a growl. Then, without getting up, she turned and army crawled low to the ground into the woods. I didn't want to go near the shore. But I kept an eye on the trees as I reached my bag, its contents now strewn all over the rocks at the water's edge. The only things she took were my keys. Luckily, my truck key ring was separate, but back at the cabin. I dreaded having to go back there, but I needed to get out of there. Who knows what that woman wanted and who she might be with? I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my other bag without even changing, and drove home to tell my parents. No way I was going to stay up there a single moment longer. But the worst part? My house keys and cabin keys were on the same key ring. My family changed the locks on both the cabin and the house the following week. My friend and I went hiking over Memorial Day weekend in New Hampshire. At the time, we were both novice hikers, so we stayed on the trails and planned to use the Forest Service shelters along the way. On the first afternoon, we reached the first shelter just before dusk. These shelters are 3-sided log cabins with the front of the cabin open to the elements. We made dinner, hung the rest of our food in a tree to keep bears at bay, and kept a fire going until around 10 when we fell asleep. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. I could hear my friend snoring lightly nearby, and it took me a few minutes to realize where I was. I was staring at the back of the cabin, and as my eyes adjusted in the darkness, I recognized the dark grooves between each log in the wall. I normally sleep well at night, so something outside the shelter must have disturbed me. I turned to look towards the open side of the shelter. There was the distinct dark shape of a person peering around the edge of the wall. I could just make out the head and shoulder, but the night was too dark to see a face or any more detail. As I sat up, the figure moved out of sight around the wall of the shelter. I fumbled for my flashlight, and the noise woke my friend. She mumbled something, and I hushed her. I could hear her sitting up. I aimed my flashlight towards the darkness beyond the shelter's edge, but there was nothing there but trees. I quietly told my friend what I'd seen, and we listened for steps or movement sounds, anything outside the shelter. But we didn't hear anything. That was almost worse. If there was no movement, that person could still be out there. I hopped off the edge of the shelter and stepped away from it into the darkness, my big flashlight out in front of me to use as a weapon. I wanted enough distance between me and whoever might be around the corner of that shelter. I walked the perimeter of the shelter, expecting someone to jump out at me at any second, but there was nobody there. I climbed back under the roof, but after that scare, there was no chance of us getting back to sleep. We rationalized that I'd had a dream, or that maybe it was a deer, or something else that belonged in the woods, unlike us. At dawn, it rained hard, and we were thankful to be inside the shelter, despite the weird night we'd had. The rain let up just after 7, and we sloshed through the mud to our hanging food bags so we could make breakfast. As we rounded the corner of the shelter, we saw large foot impressions in the mud leading away from the shelter. This meant whoever had been watching us sleep had been just outside the shelter until after dawn. They had been there for hours, just on the other side of the shelter wall. When I was a kid, my mom moved us from Birmingham, Alabama to a small rural town outside the city. Mom worked late on weeknights, so my older sister and I rode the bus home and let ourselves in after school. Our rental house was near the end of our road, and we shared the driveway with our landlord, who lived in the last house just past ours. It was a rundown trailer surrounded by pig enclosures with high wood panel fencing. When it was really hot, we'd have to close our windows because of the horrible pig smell. One day, close to the end of the school year, our landlord's small pickup truck drove slowly past us as we walked down the hot, humid country road from the bus stop. He had the passenger side window down and was smiling at us. He slowed to a stop, and my sister stopped and grabbed my arm. She did not like him. But as we stood there, our neighbor's German Shepherd Ruby was running towards us from her yard. As soon as he saw her, the landlord's brake lights went dark and the car started rolling forward again. Ruby was our neighbor's dog, and if she was out, our neighbor was probably working on his old car. She loved us because we'd give her leftover snacks on the way home from school. She'd show up at our house sometimes and sleep on our back porch in the shade. If you didn't know her, though, you'd think twice watching her run at you. As the landlord drove away, my sister hung back. I remembered not caring that I was sweating in the hot Alabama sun because I was giving Ruby my leftover carrots. It was uncanny how often the landlord would be driving down our country road just as we were walking from the bus stop. He would always slow down and smile. When we'd get inside the house, my sister would lock the front door behind us and check the back door, which we always kept locked. Being a kid, this just became normal for me, and I learned to lock the doors too. When my sister was in the 8th grade, her class did a week-long trip to Washington, D.C., so I had to spend that week alone after school. As I walked home alone that first afternoon, I saw our landlord's truck drive past. He slowed down, his passenger side window down. He was smiling, but it made me uncomfortable. He tipped his stained, dirty hat and asked where my sister was. I told him she was away for the week. Now I know that was the wrong thing to have said, but I was a kid and didn't know any better. When I got inside the house, I locked the front door behind me and checked the back door, which was already locked, just like my sister did when we'd come home together. I went to my room to watch TV and to do my homework. But it wasn't long before I smelled the pigs. It was a hot day, and I got up to go close the windows at the far end of the house. Walking through the living room, I remember the smell getting stronger, and I hurried to the kitchen to the window over the sink. Pushing it closed, I heard whining on the back porch and knew Ruby was looking for her snack. I expected the usual Ruby face lick when I opened the door, but she blew past me, whining and barking loudly. As she disappeared down the hall, I heard the front door in the living room close loudly. Ruby was lunging at the door now, and there were muddy boot prints in the living room. The living room that I had just walked through. When my mom got home, I told her what happened and she called the police. Since there was no sign of forced entry, the police assumed the door was either unlocked or the intruder had a key to the house. I knew I had locked the door, so the police questioned the landlord. He denied entering the house, but also said that being our landlord, he could enter to check on things as he wanted. My mom broke the lease and moved out the following week. Although we couldn't prove it, I know he was in the house. I know the pig smell was strong because he was inside the house. He was probably just behind me when I let Ruby in. He watched us come home from school every day, and when he saw me alone, he made his move. When I moved to Florida and into this house, I imagined creating an outdoor patio oasis with space to have friends over and relax. The house has big glass doors that face the yard, and the backyard was going to be a natural extension of the house. I even took the blinds down, feeling secure with the fence and the wooded area as a buffer for anyone looking in. But that first week I moved in, everything changed. My home office faces the yard, and just before wrapping up for the day, I looked up from my monitor, and I saw a head at the fence. It was pale, almost gray, and I couldn't make out the shape of the face very well, like it was diluted or blurry. I put my glasses on to see better, but it was gone. It scared me, but I half thought I had imagined it because my fence is taller at the back to compensate for the downward slope of the property. There's no way anybody could be that tall. I watched the fence line for a few seconds, and when nothing happened, I stood up to turn off the light in the room as it was getting dark out, and I was now clearly visible. When I turned back around, it was there again, but it stayed there, watching me from above the fence. It had no hair, just pale gray skin and dark holes where eyes should have been. It almost looked like someone was wearing a mask. I reached for my phone, looking away for just an instant, but when I looked back up, it was gone. I got up and walked to the far end of my house where it was darkest, where I thought I wouldn't be seen from the yard. I watched the fence for a few more minutes. But when nothing happened, I assumed it was some kids from the next neighborhood trying to freak me out. I put the blinds back up the next morning and kept them open just enough to let some light in. I periodically checked the fence line, but saw nothing. That afternoon, I was on a video call and looked up to see the head was there again watching me. I must have looked shocked because my coworker asked me what was wrong. I looked back at the meeting and then it was gone again. I checked the gate at the back of the fence. It was unlocked, which is not how I left it. It can only easily be unlocked from the inside, so someone had to work to get it open. While I was back there, I stepped through the gate beyond the fence, something I hadn't thought to do before buying the house. I had to be careful walking through the overgrown brush on the ground, and I kept an eye out for snakes or red ants. That's when I noticed the barbed wire. There were thick double coils of it extending along the full length of my property fence at knee level. I almost ran right into it. There were big palm fronds and piles of leaves and other debris covering the coils, as though someone had wanted to hide it. I don't know why it was put there, but I know for sure that whatever was watching me over that fence would have been standing right where the barbed wire was, and that would have been impossible without getting badly injured. I have cameras on order, and my backyard plans are going to have to wait until I figure out what's been watching me. I'll update when I know more. It's happening. I'm shuddering and shaking in my closet, dialing 911, trying to get my thoughts together so I can remember everything. I hear his footsteps in the hallway, getting closer, his voice calling for Sabrina. Then I feel the storm of panic, and my mind goes dark. Let me back up. 2 weeks ago, my roommate and best friend unintentionally set my current nightmare in motion just before she traveled to Belgium for work. Her job kept her overseas for months at a time, making her an easy roommate to have. She always paid her bills on time and was only in the house a few weeks a year. Before Sabrina left on her last trip, she hired a handyman to fix the back door which led to the kitchen of our house. There's something wrong with the door's alignment, and getting the back door locked properly was a chore. We'd been leaving it unlocked lately. Sabrina worried for my safety now that I'd be alone again, even though we have Ring cameras on the front and back doors and a motion camera in the living room. But really, I know she worries more about my health. I have epilepsy and take medication that keeps the seizures under control. With my meds, the seizures are rare. I know Sabrina had meant well, but she was a last-minute kind of person and hired someone on the fly in the whirlwind before her trip. Mike knocked on the door on the afternoon Sabrina left. Opening the door, I saw a thin, tall man wearing a black hoodie and a dirty baseball hat and jeans. He also had a backpack over his shoulder. No toolbox, just the backpack. He grinned when he saw me and stepped closer. I instinctively narrowed the opening in the door, asking him what he wanted. He leaned oddly into the space of the open door, pushing his mouth into the gap, like he had a secret to tell. He loudly announced someone had called him to fix the door. My sensitive nose caught a whiff of him. He smelled musty, like an old attic. It took me a second to process what he'd said, but then I realized this was the guy Sabrina must have hired, and wasn't some salesman or worse. I rolled my eyes at myself. I'd been watching too many true crime videos lately. I opened the door and watched him run his hand slowly along the edge of the door frame as he stared at me. I explained to him that it was the back door and he should meet me at the back of the house. I closed and locked the door. Sabrina may have called him, but I wasn't just going to let any stranger into my house. I met him at the back door and showed him the issue with the lock. He looked at it briefly, all the while fidgeting with his backpack zipper. He said he'd be back the next day to fix it, and we agreed on a time. After saying our goodbyes, I closed the unlockable door and turned away. But Mike didn't move. He was watching me through the window in the door, and when he saw me look back at him, he waved at me, unsmiling and otherwise standing perfectly still. His posture was odd, not turned away like he would be if he was leaving, but standing squarely in front of the door like he was waiting for more. We looked at each other for long enough that I was completely unnerved by his creepy waving. I turned away and moved farther back into the house, where I didn't think he could see me, and when I turned back, he was gone. I looked out the front window, but there was no car. He had just disappeared. It was hard to imagine a contractor without a vehicle, but nothing about this guy was normal. The next day, his arrival time came and went, and Mike never showed up. I was relieved. I really didn't want to deal with him again. I let Sabrina know and told her I'd hire someone else. Which I did. I hired a professional contractor with good reviews and experience, and the door was fixed that day. I didn't think about it again until I got a knock at the front door a few days later. It was the usual mail delivery time, so I didn't think to check my Ring camera. I wish I had. Opening the door, I saw Mike standing there, and immediately closed it to just a crack. He quickly leaned too close to the opening and asked me why I'd left him a bad review online. I had no idea what he was talking about. That's when he asked me if I was Sabrina, and it all came together. She must have left him a bad online review, and now he was standing here, angry at me. I told him I wasn't Sabrina, apologized, and closed the door. Through the Ring camera, I watched him clench his fists, and then yell through the door that I had to remove the review today, and he'd be back to fix the door. When I didn't respond, he faced the camera, waving again. He waved for 3 awkward minutes, turned, and left. I hoped he'd gotten the hint. The next day, when I was gone for work, I got the Ring notification and checked the app to see Mike standing at my door, repeatedly ringing the bell. Before leaving, he faced the camera for a few seconds, and then tried the doorknob. This was getting out of control. The next day was Saturday, and I was making breakfast when I heard the intrusive sound of the back doorknob jiggling. Startled, I turned and saw Mike with his hand on the door. He was looking through the window at me with a blank stare. He yelled at me that he needed the negative review removed and continued to jiggle the doorknob. As I reached for my phone, I saw him opening his backpack. Then I yelled, "I'm calling the police!" He turned and left. I called them anyway, but they just warned me to keep my doors locked and to call them if he came back. While I was at work today, my Ring camera caught Mike at the back door again. Horrified, I watched him look directly at the camera, staring at it for 8 long minutes until finally leaving. Now I really felt like I was in danger in my own home. Once I was home, there were no more camera notifications. At bedtime that night, I locked my bedroom door, just in case. In the morning, I'd have to call Sabrina to find out more about this guy she had hired. I also decided to visit the police station and see what I could do to protect myself. I hadn't been asleep long when the Ring detected movement at the back door, followed by the living room camera alert. I jumped out of bed with my phone and ran to the closet. I knew it was Mike. It was finally happening. As I shuddered and shook in my closet, I dialed 911 and tried to get my thoughts together so I would remember everything. I heard his footsteps in the hallway getting closer, his voice calling for Sabrina. Then I felt the storm of panic and my mind went dark. I woke up coughing, my throat burning, and I pulled at the rope around my neck. 3 uniformed cops were peering over me as I recovered from the seizure. One of the 3 asked me if I was Sabrina, and I shook my head. Another cop was in the hallway, going through the familiar backpack. I saw him dump the bag's contents onto my floor. Another rope, a hunting knife, and a set of handcuffs. He also found a wallet and read aloud, "Mike Rosello, 3840 West Porterfield Lane." The man that had broken into my house, the man the police found tightening the rope around my neck, squeezing the breath from my convulsing body, was my neighbor. I like to think about them. The blue leather bracelet that was so old, its ties were soft and frayed. The keychain with the initials PT. I held that keychain for hours while I worked, but since he'd had no wallet, I didn't know if the initials were his or if they belonged to someone he loved. Then there was the glass eye. It was a chocolatey brown color, like his hair, or what was left of it. Not all my treasures were as high quality as that eye. Sometimes I could only keep some fingernail clippings or eyelashes or other mere ephemera. The hours I spent with those bodies, cleaning, then cutting them, were magical. They needed to be perfect. I kept the door locked so we wouldn't be disturbed. The little treasures I kept were useless to everyone else, but not to me. I kept them in my tin box in the hole I'd cut in the back of my closet, each of them wrapped in a supple buckskin cloth to avoid them contaminating each other. They couldn't touch. That would be wrong. Most days, when I was alone, I'd take my treasures out of my tin box and unwrap them, placing them on my table, spaced equally apart on their leather wraps, precisely in formation. They were a comfort to me. I had no idea cameras had been installed. They'd probably gone in after that nosy husband asked why his wife's body was missing a fingernail. I don't know how he even noticed. But they had me on camera atop the John Doe's gurney, removing his eyelid. That ruined everything. The eyelid could have been overlooked, but my stupid neighbor made another smell complaint, I'm sure of it. They were so intrusive. Luckily, I had cameras of my own. I saw the cops searching my dingy apartment. I saw them tear through my closet, find my treasure box, and open it. One of them must have been a rookie because he threw up all over my floor. That would have to change if he was going to stick it out. Over time, he'd get used to the smells, maybe even come to love them like I do. Years of working in a morgue has a way of changing you. A few years ago, I was driving to a friend's baby shower outside of Anchorage, past Palmer. It was evening when I left her house to start the 40-ish mile drive back to Anchorage. By the time I reached the Old Glen Highway Bridge that crossed the Matanuska River, it was almost full dark. There's a turn there where you can pull off, park, and watch the river from a walking footbridge. It had become my tradition to stop there whenever I went up to visit my friend. The air was crisp that night, and the river was flowing, free of ice. On evenings like this, it was exhilarating to stand at the center of that footbridge, listening to the black water rushing below as the moon rose overhead. I parked and hopped out to stretch, glad for the break. Looking across towards the opposite side, I found myself alone as I approached the footbridge. There weren't any hikers in sight, and the parking area was deserted. The thought crossed my mind that it was a bit late for a stop, but it was a tradition, and I'd be quick. When I reached the center of the bridge, I closed my eyes, listening to the roaring waters beneath me, and felt the cool summer air against my face. When I opened my eyes, I caught movement at the end of the bridge. Someone was standing at the entrance of the bridge about 20 feet from my car. For a moment, I thought it was a bear. We have plenty of those here, and I watched it now, standing perfectly still, holding my breath. But it was so dark, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It crouched down like a bear might, but it didn't move. I waited for a long moment, slowly reaching for the K-bar knife on my belt. I pulled it from its sheath and held it at my side. Whatever it wasn't moving. It was waiting. I had 3 options. I could go past it and get to my car. I could cross the bridge at the other side and then walk back along the highway to my car, but there was no guarantee it wouldn't get between me and my car again. And finally, I could wait for it to leave, but if it started chasing me, I'd be unprepared, and that's never ideal. I decided to walk past it. With my knife in hand, I pulled my shoulders back and started towards my car. As I got closer, the figure raised its head enough for me to see the whites of its eyes in the moonlight, but nothing more. It was a man wearing a long black cloak with a hood, crouched low to the ground. With its head upturned in the hood, he was scenting the air. He was poised, like he was ready to run. If I could reach the end of this bridge, I knew I could get to my car. As I passed the crouched figure, his head raised higher, and I saw pale, sallow white skin under the cloak above his black eyes. Those eyes were tracking me, and I felt like I was walking into a trap. His head lifted far into his cloak, revealing his mouth, and he raised his hands and licked his fingers. Something dark was on each finger, but I couldn't tell what it was. His mouth was turned into a smile, and I cringed, turning towards my car, breaking into a run. I heard him spring from his crouched position towards me, but I was fast. I reached my car and flung my door open, looking back towards the bridge. But he was gone. As I peeled out of the parking space, I almost hit a pickup truck that had pulled up behind me. The driver waved me down, and I saw it was a state trooper. She said she'd decided to check the parking lot for bear after almost running over a mangled deer at the turnoff. I asked her how she knew it was a bear. "Oh, you can tell. It's been ripped to shreds. Definitely a hungry bear. It's odd that it left the deer out there in the road, though. Something must have spooked it. Or maybe it got on the trail of something else to hunt." I work at a 24-hour pharmacy store. Usually, I work with at least one other person, but my scheduled coworker, who had been buzzing about her Halloween costume and a party with her roommate for weeks, conveniently fell sick. I knew better. This left me solo, manning the register on a forsaken night when even the bravest avoided the graveyard shift. Early hours buzzed with activity, but as the sun went down, the store was dead. When scrolling through my phone lost its appeal and it became painfully clear that no customers would be shopping on Halloween night, I ducked into the storeroom to grab some boxes to stock shelves. There's a bell that sounds at the door when someone enters. With the storeroom door ajar, I could hear when someone arrived. With a box cradled in my arms, I stepped into the brightness of the store to unbox and stock. And then it happened. Total darkness. I looked past the row of shelves, out the front windows, where the world outside had also plunged into darkness. A local power outage. I felt relieved when the emergency lights kicked on, their feeble glow casting eerie shadows in the dim store. But as I looked out the window again, I felt a knot of dread in my gut. Those emergency lights were exclusive to my store. Everything beyond those doors was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone and punched in my manager's number as I walked to the back to grab my bag. There was no way I was going to stay here in the dark all night. As I got her voicemail, I heard the bell's faint chime echo from the front of the store. Pivoting, I scanned the entrance, but there was nobody there. "We're closed." There was no response. The dimly lit store seemed to hold its breath, heavy with something ugly. I was about to step out from the back, thinking maybe whoever had come in hadn't heard me, when I saw them. 3 figures carrying bats rushed feverishly at me, moving unnaturally fast. Without thinking, I bolted for the back room and slammed the door shut just in the nick of time. The tiny office was little more than a glorified closet, a cramped, windowless space filled with nothing but a desk, some shelves, and thankfully a heavy metal door. I leaned against it at first, but with each drumbeat strike on the door, I felt the vibrations ripple through the walls like shock waves. The relentless pounding made me step back as far as I could. I tasted terror in every ragged breath, trapped in that suffocating coffin of an office. My back was pressed against cold, unfeeling shelves, their edges digging into my flesh as if trying to reach my bones. Time warped in that claustrophobic dark space, my hands clenched into fists, nails dug into my palms, anchoring me to reality. I cried desperate tears, realizing I was trapped, utterly helpless, and unprepared for what was beyond that door. I covered my ears and closed my eyes. After several loud strikes against the door, everything went silent. In the darkness, I uncovered my ears, straining to hear anything. There was nothing. No whispered conversations, no telltale footsteps, nothing but an unnerving vacuum of sound. My trembling hands fumbled through the darkness, searching for that reassuring feel of my phone to dial the police. The seconds stretched agonizingly as I waited, unsure if I was alone again or if they were baiting me to come out. When the police finally arrived, the store was calm, intact. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing stolen or even disturbed. It was as though my attackers had been swallowed by the darkness. But the gouges and dents in the metal door were evidence enough. The doorknob almost wrenched clean off. I'll never know why they singled me out, but I do know they were dangerously close to breaching that office.